On the night of August 11, 1492, the bells of Rome echoed through a city simmering with tension, ambition, and whispered rumor. The College of Cardinals had just concluded one of the most fiercely contested papal conclaves in Renaissance history. As torches flickered against the old stones of the Apostolic Palace, word spread quickly through taverns, noble courts, and the narrow alleys around the Tiber. Rodrigo Borgia, the powerful Spanish cardinal whose influence stretched from the papal treasury to the private chambers of Rome's most elite families, had been elected pope. The announcement shocked Europe, not because Rodrigo lacked power, but because everyone understood exactly how that power had been cultivated. His election marked the beginning of one of the most controversial papacies ever recorded, a reign defined by political scheming, ruthless ambition, and an unprecedented display of personal immorality that would stain the Vatican for centuries. To understand why observers across Europe reacted with astonishment and even outrage, one must look backward into the decades that shaped Rodrigo Borgia's rise. Born in 1431 in the Valencian town of Zativa, Rodrigo came from a family whose fortunes changed dramatically through one key figure, his uncle, Alfonso de Borgia. Alfonso, a shrewd ecclesiastical lawyer, had been elevated to cardinal in 1444 and later became Pope Calixtus Roman III. This gave the Borgia family a foothold at the very center of papal politics, a position they would exploit with relentless determination. When Rodrigo arrived in Rome in his early 20s, he entered a world unlike anything he had known in Spain. The city was both the spiritual heart of Western Christianity and the political battleground of rival noble families. The papal states, stretching across central Italy, were governed not like a monastery but like a kingdom, complete with armies, diplomats, and espionage networks. Cardinals controlled land, wealth, and patronage equivalent to princes, and papal elections often reflected the ambitions of powerful clans such as the Orsini, Colonna, and Medici. Rodrigo advanced rapidly. His uncle, Pope Calixtus Roman III, appointed him vice-chancellor of the Church, one of the most important administrative positions in the papal government. This office placed him in charge of the vast bureaucratic machinery that managed revenues, appointments, and legal matters across Christendom. As vice-chancellor, Rodrigo acquired not only wealth and influence, but a reputation for cunning political judgment, and an ability to manipulate alliances in ways that astonished his peers. It was during these years that his personal life began to attract scandal. Renaissance Rome was not a city of saintly restraint. Many clerics openly kept mistresses, fathered children, or indulged in luxuries that contradicted their vows. But even in such an environment, Rodrigo's behavior stood out. His long relationship with Vanosa de Catane, a Roman noblewoman, produced several children, the most famous being Cesare, Lucrezia, Joffer, and Juan. For a cardinal to keep a mistress was not unheard of, but to establish an entire family with one, maintain properties for them, and elevate them openly in Roman society was far beyond the typical impropriety is tolerated among church leaders. Still, Rodrigo Borgia continued climbing. Wealth poured into his coffers through benefices, bribes, and shrewd financial management of church properties. His charisma and political skill made him a towering figure within the Vatican. Popes and cardinals frequently relied on him to negotiate difficult matters, whether diplomatic disputes or internal conflicts. He became known not only as a strategist, but as a man capable of orchestrating the outcome of major decisions with almost theatrical precision. By the time Pope Innocent Roman VIII died in 1492, Rodrigo Borgia was one of the most powerful men in Europe. But transforming that power into the papacy required more than influence. It required winning the votes of cardinals who themselves were deeply entangled in political rivalries. The conclave of 1492 became one of the most controversial in church history. Accusations of simony, or the buying of church offices, plagued the process. Historians and primary sources suggest that Rodrigo offered lands, offices, and significant sums of money to key electors. Several cardinals suddenly found themselves granted lucrative benefices or positions within the papal administration shortly before the election. Though such corruption was hardly unusual for the period, the sheer scale of the operation shocked even those accustomed to the politics of Renaissance Rome. On the morning after the conclave, when the smoke rose signaling a decision, Rome braced itself. Rodrigo Borgia emerged from the Sistine Chapel as Pope Alexander VI. The new pope chose a name that invoked Alexander the Great, a nod to ambition and conquest. His coronation was celebrated with lavish ceremonies, but beneath the splendor lay a deep unease. Diplomats, ambassadors, princes, and church reformers quickly recognized that the election of Alexander VI would not be a spiritual transformation of the church, but a political turning point for Italy. The new pope wasted no time asserting his authority. His first acts favored his children, most notably Cesare, whom he elevated to the rank of cardinal, despite Cesare's clear desire for military and political leadership rather than a life of devotion. Lucrezia, his daughter, also became a key figure in papal diplomacy. Her marriages arranged to cement alliances with powerful Italian families. Alexander VI used his office not to advance reform or spiritual goals, but to strengthen the Borgia dynasty. But it was not only politics that marked his early years as pope. Reports circulated across Rome of feasts, illicit relationships, and scandalous behavior within the papal court. Banquets held at the Vatican included choirs, dancers, and entertainments that blurred the line between political hospitality and outright decadence. The Church's spiritual mission seemed almost forgotten amid spectacles of wealth and sensual indulgence. Alexander's preference for opulence was matched only by his willingness to crush opposition. Rival families who challenged his authority faced imprisonment, assassination, or the seizure of their estates. Those who cooperated were rewarded handsomely. By the late 1490s, all of Italy felt the ripple effects of Alexander VI reign. Wars between rival states intensified, alliances shifted unpredictably, and the presence of foreign powers, especially France and Spain, grew increasingly dangerous. Many chroniclers of the time described Alexander as a master manipulator whose decisions fueled instability across the peninsula. Yet he remained firm in his pursuit of power, wealth, and influence for his family. The early period of Alexander VI papacy did more than reshape politics. It revealed the depth of corruption within the late medieval church. While spiritual leaders elsewhere sought reform, the Borgia court projected an image of excess that scandalized Europe. Reformers like Girolamo Savonarola of Florence denounced the Pope as a symbol of moral decay. Though Alexander ultimately excommunicated and executed Savonarola, the preacher's warnings resonated with many who saw the Church losing its authority and moral credibility. As the years passed, Alexander VI's name became synonymous with a new understanding of papal power. He embodied the height of Renaissance ambition, combining political ruthlessness with personal indulgence. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation, which would erupt decades after his death, were in many ways nourished by the scandals and corruption of his rule. The story of Alexander VI is not a tale of secret romances with nuns, a myth invented in later centuries, but a documented history of a man whose choices reshaped Europe. His rise from Spanish nobleman to the most controversial pope in history set the stage for one of the most dramatic and consequential papacies ever recorded. When the new century approached, Rome stood at the center of a storm, stirred by the ambitions of Pope Alexander VI and the rising power of his children, most notably Cesare and Lucrezia. By 1494, only 2 years into his papacy, Alexander had already reshaped the political map of Italy in ways no pope had attempted for centuries. Yet what followed in the mid and late 1490s would escalate the turmoil into full-scale wars, assassinations, betrayals, and family scandals that astonished Europe. The Vatican was no longer a tranquil seat of Christian leadership. It had become a fortress of dynastic ambition, and Alexander VI was its architect. Italy at that time was not a unified nation. It was a collection of fiercely independent states: Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples, and the Papal States. Each was governed by a ruling family or coalition of elites who guarded their authority with armies, alliances, and careful diplomacy. The peninsula was also caught between the ambitions of France and Spain, both seeking to expand their influence. For a pope to navigate this environment required delicacy. For Alexander VI, however, it required something else entirely. He wanted not only to rule but to dominate, and he wanted his children positioned as aristocrats whose power would extend far beyond Rome. Cesare Borgia, the most notorious of Alexander's offspring, played a central role in escalating the conflicts of this period. Originally groomed for a church career, Cesare had been made cardinal in his teenage years, but it soon became clear that he lacked any interest in spiritual responsibilities. He preferred armor to vestments, battlefields to ceremonies. He saw the church as a platform for his own ambitions, not as a calling. Alexander understood this and began reshaping roles around his son's desires. This shift alone caused unease among the cardinals, many of whom had never witnessed a pope so openly redesign the church to favor his family. As foreign powers watched the situation unfold, France made its move. In 1494, King Charles Roman VIII invaded Italy, claiming a hereditary right to the Kingdom of Naples. His armies, equipped with modern artillery and disciplined infantry, swept through the peninsula with alarming speed. Many Italian states fell or surrendered without resistance. It was the first major foreign invasion Italy had experienced in generations, and it transformed the political landscape overnight. Alexander VI found himself in a precarious position. He could not openly oppose France without risking military defeat, but he also could not allow Charles Roman VIII to seize Naples uncontested, since it threatened papal interests. Alexander responded with a mix of diplomacy and manipulation. He welcomed Charles into Rome, treated him with courtesy, and negotiated terms that spared the city from destruction. During these negotiations, Alexander personally confronted the French king, challenging him with remarkable boldness for a man surrounded by foreign troops. The Pope's combination of intimidation, charm, and strategic concessions allowed him to survive the French presence without losing control. But the consequences of the invasion were enormous. The speed and success of the French campaign revealed the weakness of Italian states and exposed how deeply divided the peninsula had become. For Alexander, it also opened opportunities. France's temporary occupation of Italy weakened long-standing alliances, disrupted political balances, and allowed Cesare to pursue his own rising ambitions. By the late 1490s, Cesare Borgia began transitioning from cardinal to military leader. Alexander secured a dispensation that allowed Cesare to shed his ecclesiastical title, something rarely granted by the papacy. This move shocked European courts. A pope allowing his son to abandon the cardinalate to become a warlord appeared to many as a sign that Alexander VI had abandoned the Church's spiritual mission entirely. Cesare embraced his new role with relentless determination. He formed an army composed of mercenaries, local recruits, and soldiers supplied by France. With the support of Louis Roman XII, who had succeeded Charles Roman VIII, Cesare launched a campaign across the Romagna region to bring rebellious towns and rival lords under direct papal control. His military operations were brutal, swift, and strategically brilliant. Cities such as Imola, Forli, Rimini, and Pesaro fell to him one by one. Cesare displayed a combination of charisma and ruthlessness that terrified adversaries. Those who submitted were spared and rewarded. Those who resisted were eliminated. Throughout this period, Alexander VI functioned not as a distant overseer, but as the guiding force behind Cesare's military and political strategies. Every victory strengthened the Borgia dynasty. Every conquered territory expanded the papal domain. But every act of violence, every betrayal, also added to the growing outrage across Europe. Many princes, diplomats, and church leaders believed that the papacy had transformed into a military dictatorship. Meanwhile, Lucrezia Borgia became a symbolic figure in these years. Her marriages, arranged by Alexander, were political tools designed to secure alliances. She married Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro to strengthen ties with the powerful Sforza family of Milan. When the alliance no longer benefited the Borgias, Alexander arranged for the marriage to be annulled. This caused a scandal that echoed across Europe. Giovanni Sforza claimed that the Pope had forced the annulment for political convenience, leading to rumors that would follow Lucrezia for centuries. These accusations, though exaggerated and often invented by enemies of the Borgias, were powerful enough to solidify her controversial reputation. Alexander VI continued to escalate his political maneuvers. He used diplomacy, bribery, intimidation, and military pressure to consolidate the Borgia territories. He restructured the Vatican's finances to support Cesare's campaigns, sold church offices to allies, and raised unprecedented sums to fund the expansion of papal armies. His critics argued that the Church's treasury was being drained not for spiritual purposes, but for the personal ambitions of his family. The climax of this escalation came in 1497 and 1498, years marked by personal tragedy and political upheaval. Juan Borgia, Alexander's favorite son, was murdered under mysterious circumstances. His body was found in the Tiber with multiple wounds. The crime shocked the papal court, and Alexander was devastated. Several theories surfaced regarding the identity of the murderer. Some blamed rival families, others accused Cesare, who allegedly resented Juan's favored position. Though historians remain divided, the murder deepened the atmosphere of suspicion and fear surrounding the Borgias. Alexander's grief drove him into a temporary withdrawal from political affairs, but the pause was brief. By 1499, he returned to the center of action, supporting Cesare's next phase of conquest. This period marked the peak of Borgia power. Cesare dominated central Italy. Alexander commanded the Vatican with iron determination. Their enemies feared them. Their allies flattered them. And the papacy had never been so deeply entangled in earthly ambition. Yet, even as the Borgias rose, signs of instability began to appear. Cesare's reliance on mercenaries made his power fragile. Foreign alliances shifted rapidly. The moral authority of the Vatican eroded. And across Italy, resentment toward Borgia rule grew stronger each year. The escalation of violence, corruption, and political manipulation had created a system that could expand but not endure. By the end of the decade, the Borgias stood at the height of power, but the foundations beneath them were already weakening. By the dawn of the year 1500, the Borgias seemed unstoppable. Pope Alexander VI ruled Rome with a firm, calculating hand, while his son Cesare cut a path of conquest across central Italy. But history rarely allows absolute power to endure. Beneath the surface of triumph, cracks began to form within the very structure that the Borgias had built. Alliances weakened, enemies gathered strength, and fate began to maneuver toward the dramatic unraveling of Alexander's world. The turning point emerged from the same force that had once been the dynasty's greatest weapon, Cesare Borgia. His military success had given him authority unlike anything seen by a papal prince. Towns that had never bowed to Rome now submitted to him. Nobles who had defied the papacy for generations now pledged loyalty out of fear or strategic necessity. Yet Cesare's rule depended heavily on a delicate balance of resources and political support. He required money to pay armies, alliances to secure regions, and papal backing to legitimize his conquests. Any disruption in this balance threatened his entire position. The first sign of instability appeared when several mercenary captains in Cesare's service began to second, guess their allegiance. Men like Vitellozzo Vitelli, Paolo Orsini, and Oliverotto da Fermo were seasoned commanders who had fought for various Italian lords over the years. They were loyal only to opportunity. When Cesare began expanding rapidly, these men grew fearful that once he consolidated power, he would no longer need their services. They watched as he replaced certain commanders with newer recruits and took direct control of strategic fortresses. Rumors circulated that Cesare intended to eliminate any captain who had grown too influential or too independent. These fears were not entirely unfounded. Cesare had already demonstrated his willingness to eliminate opponents with ruthless efficiency. His reputation alone made many uneasy. As a result, a secret league was formed in late 1001 by Vitellozzo, the Orsini faction, and several other nobles who had once served him. Their goal was simple: to remove Cesare before he became too powerful. The conspirators sought allies among foreign powers and Italian states, hoping to create a coalition strong enough to defeat the Borgia forces. Alexander VI learned of the conspiracy through his extensive network of spies and informants. The Pope fully understood how dangerous such a coalition could be. The survival of the Borgia dynasty depended on Cesare's continued success. Without his son, Alexander's political structure would collapse. He therefore encouraged Cesare to act decisively, and Cesare responded with a plan that displayed both brilliance and cold calculation. Rather than meet the conspirators in open battle, Cesare pretended to negotiate peace. He extended offers of reconciliation and invited the mercenary leaders to a series of meetings. The conspirators, desperate to avoid a costly war and reassured by Cesare's seemingly conciliatory tone, agreed. In a now famous encounter at the town of Senigallia in January 1002, Cesare welcomed Vitellozzo and the others with smiles, handshakes, and assurances of forgiveness. But it was a trap. Once the captains were inside the city and separated from their troops, Cesare's forces seized them. The Pope's son personally supervised their executions. The Senigallia purge was a turning point. With his most dangerous rivals eliminated, Cesare regained firm control of the Romagna, but the political cost was high. Italian courts were horrified by his deception. Even Machiavelli, who admired Cesare's strategic genius and later used him as a model in his writings, admitted that the brutality of Senigallia shook the region. Trust in Cesare evaporated. No lord, no mercenary, no diplomat felt secure. The Borgias were feared more than ever, yet their alliances became harder to maintain. Meanwhile, tensions rose within the Vatican. Critics of Alexander VI accused him of caring more about Cesare's campaigns than the spiritual welfare of the Church. Reports circulated of continued corruption, lavish feasts, and extravagant expenditures. Reformers across Europe spoke openly of the Vatican's moral decline. Alexander's own cardinals, many of whom had benefited from his patronage, now began distancing themselves. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. The scandalous reign of Alexander VI could not continue indefinitely. The broader political situation also shifted against the Borgias. France, which had been Cesare's primary backer, changed its priorities when Louis Roman XII sought new alliances in Italy. The French king faced pressure from the Habsburgs, Spanish forces, and shifting Italian coalitions. Maintaining Cesare's campaigns became less valuable to France. Without French military support or political protection, Cesare's expansionist vision began to crumble. As these pressures mounted, fortune delivered the final blow in a form no strategist could predict. In August 1503, Rome was struck by a severe and deadly outbreak of fever, likely malaria. The Vatican, always crowded in summer with diplomats, clerics, servants, and soldiers, became a place of fear. People collapsed in the streets. Physicians struggled to understand the sudden surge in deaths. When the fever reached the upper levels of the papal palace, the consequences were catastrophic. Pope Alexander VI fell ill rapidly. Accounts from the time describe him burning with fever, vomiting, and drifting in and out of consciousness. The speed of his decline shocked even his enemies. Cesare, who had been with him, also fell gravely ill. For days the two most powerful men in Rome lay bedridden, their fates intertwined. Alexander VI died on August 18, 1503. His death reverberated across Italy. Many viewed it as divine judgment. Others saw it as the inevitable collapse of a corrupt dynasty. His body, according to several contemporary accounts, was swollen from disease and had to be handled with difficulty by attendants. Crowds gathered outside the Vatican, not to mourn, but to gossip and speculate. The powerful pope whose ambition had dominated Italy was gone, leaving behind a legacy defined by controversy, brilliance, and scandal. Cesare survived his illness, but the consequences of Alexander's death were immediate and overwhelming. Cesare's authority, which had depended on papal backing, vanished overnight. Rival families reclaimed territories he had conquered. Towns he once controlled declared independence. Former allies turned against him. The Vatican, now under new leadership, made it clear that Cesare's influence was finished. Cardinals who had long feared the Borgias seized the moment. Within weeks, the properties, fortresses, and political positions Cesare had acquired were stripped away. He attempted to negotiate his survival, but without his father, without French support, and without resources, he found himself isolated. Eventually, he was arrested and imprisoned. His escape, flight, and eventual death in battle years later would mark the tragic end of a man who had once dreamed of ruling all Italy. The collapse was not limited to Cesare. Lucrezia, though spared the political destruction that consumed her brothers, was forced to reinvent her life far from Rome. Her arranged marriages became tools of survival rather than ambition, and she spent her later years as Duchess of Ferrara, distancing herself from the scandals of her youth. Thus the Borgia machine, which had seemed so unstoppable only a few years earlier, collapsed with astonishing speed. Its downfall underscored the fragility of political power based on fear, alliances of convenience, and personal ambition rather than stable institutions. Alexander VI's death tore the foundation out from under the dynasty he had built. What remained was the debris of a vision that had reached too far, too fast, but the consequences of their downfall would stretch far beyond the papal palace. The scandals, corruption, and political violence of Alexander VI's reign left a deep imprint on Europe. Critics of the Church pointed to the Borgia era as proof that the institution had lost its moral direction. Reformers used it as evidence in their demands for change. And within decades, these voices would coalesce into the Protestant Reformation, a seismic shift in world history. The downfall of the Borgias was not just a family tragedy. It was a turning point in the story of the Catholic Church and the political landscape of Renaissance Italy. When the power of the Borgias finally collapsed, Europe was left grappling with the consequences of one of the most controversial papacies in history. The death of Pope Alexander VI in 1503 did not simply end a reign marked by ambition and excess. It triggered a broader reckoning within the Catholic Church and shaped how future generations understood corruption, political power, and the vulnerability of religious institutions when personal ambition overrides spiritual duty. The legacy of Alexander VI is not confined to the events of his lifetime. Instead, it extends across centuries, influencing theology, politics, popular culture, and the perception of the Renaissance itself. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death was defined by confusion and political scrambling. Cesare Borgia, who had survived the fever that killed his father, attempted to retain some measure of control. But his influence had been entirely dependent on Alexander's authority and the structure of the papal administration. Without that support, Cesare found himself surrounded by enemies. Former allies abandoned him. Italian nobles reclaimed their lands. Even those who had once feared him felt emboldened to challenge his authority now that the source of his power had vanished. One of the first actions taken by the College of Cardinals after Alexander's death was to distance the Church from the Borgia legacy. The Vatican treasury, heavily depleted due to military campaigns and administrative expenses, was audited. Properties and titles granted by Alexander to his allies were reviewed or revoked. The new Pope, Pius Roman III, attempted to stabilize Rome, but he died less than a month into his papacy. His successor, Julius Roman II, would become one of the strongest opponents of the Borgia legacy. Julius had long resented Alexander and had been forced into exile during his reign. Now, in control of the papal throne, Julius Roman II dedicated significant energy to dismantling everything the Borgias had built. Yet even as the Church worked to erase the Borgias from its political structure, it could not erase the impact they had left on European consciousness. Alexander VI became a symbol of ecclesiastical corruption. His papacy offered reformers a powerful argument. If the Church wished to maintain moral authority, it needed structural and spiritual renewal. This sentiment grew stronger across Europe, especially among intellectuals and theologians who had long criticized the excesses of the Renaissance Church. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation, already germinating during Alexander's lifetime, received further nourishment from the scandals associated with his papacy. When reformers like Martin Luther emerged in the early 16th century, they frequently cited the moral decay of the Church as a justification for change. Although Luther did not base his arguments on Alexander VI specifically, the memory of Alexander's reign provided an example of ecclesiastical failure that many of Luther's contemporaries understood. The corruption of the papal court during those years became a rhetorical weapon used by critics to illustrate the dangers of unchecked power. Over time, the Borgias became larger than life, their story transformed into legend as well as history. Chroniclers, playwrights, and later novelists embellished their story, adding dramatic details that blurred the line between fact and fiction. Some tales were exaggerated, others were invented. The Borgias became characters in a wider narrative about sin, ambition, and the struggle for redemption. Alexander VI, Cesare, and Lucrezia were portrayed as figures capable of extraordinary brilliance and extraordinary vice. This blending of myth and history created enduring misconceptions. For example, Lucrezia Borgia was frequently depicted as a poisoner or seductress, a portrayal not supported by reliable historical evidence. These stories emerged from the political propaganda of rival families and were later amplified by writers seeking dramatic material. Similarly, Alexander VI was often accused of crimes that were never substantiated. His real documented actions were scandalous enough: nepotism, bribery, political manipulation, and personal indulgence. But myth-making added layers that transformed him from a flawed statesman into a figure of almost theatrical villainy. It is important to recognize that Alexander VI did not represent the entirety of Renaissance Rome. The Vatican during his time was a complex institution filled with scholars, theologians, artists, diplomats, and administrators. While Alexander pursued his own ambitions, the intellectual and cultural life of Rome continued to develop. Many of the artistic projects he supported contributed to the flourishing of Renaissance culture. His patronage extended to figures who later influenced European art and architecture. This duality is one of the paradoxes of his reign: a pope whose moral failings were undeniable, but whose contributions to culture and governance were also significant. Modern historians attempt to understand Alexander VI within the context of his era. The Renaissance was a time of political fragmentation, social transformation, and intense competition among noble families. Popes were not merely spiritual leaders, but rulers of the papal states. They commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and managed vast territories. Alexander VI did not create this system, but he exploited it more aggressively than most of his predecessors. His actions were shaped by the political expectations of his time, even as they exceeded them in scope and ambition. In evaluating his legacy, scholars often ask whether Alexander VI was uniquely immoral or simply a reflection of Renaissance politics. Many popes before and after him demonstrated ambition, favoritism, and involvement in secular affairs. But Alexander's willingness to openly prioritize his family, pursue political dominance, and enrich his offspring set him apart. His reign brought the tensions between spiritual authority and temporal power into sharp focus. His actions forced the Church to confront questions that had long been ignored. The long-term consequences of his papacy extended beyond church reform. His son Cesare became an influential figure in political theory. Niccolò Machiavelli, who observed Cesare's campaigns firsthand, used him as a model in his discussions of political strategy. In Machiavelli's writings, Cesare was presented as a ruler who understood the realities of power, its opportunities, its dangers, and the need for decisive action. Machiavelli admired Cesare's ability to adapt, his intelligence, and his cunning, even as he acknowledged that Cesare's reliance on fortune made his downfall inevitable. Thus, while Alexander VI is remembered primarily for corruption, his family's actions contributed to the foundations of modern political thought. This complexity is a reminder that history rarely offers simple villains or heroes. The Borgias were both destructive and innovative. They destabilized Italy while transforming its political landscape. They shocked Europe while shaping its intellectual future. In popular culture, the Borgias continue to captivate audiences. Television series, novels, films, and documentaries have portrayed them as embodiments of Renaissance intrigue. Their story endures because it contains elements of power, betrayal, ambition, love, violence, and downfall. Alexander VI stands at the center of this narrative as the most infamous pope in history, a man whose legacy is both cautionary and compelling. For the Catholic Church, the story of Alexander VI remains a reminder of the dangers of allowing secular ambition to overshadow spiritual responsibility. The reforms that followed his papacy, especially during the Counter-Reformation, were influenced in part by the desire to prevent another such period of scandal. The Church sought stricter oversight, clearer moral guidelines, and a renewed commitment to discipline. These efforts shaped Catholic doctrine and governance for centuries. The life and reign of Pope Alexander VI demonstrate how a single leader can reshape an institution for better or worse. His impact was profound, his actions dramatic, and his legacy impossible to ignore. He became a symbol of what happens when spiritual authority is consumed by political ambition.